The 1970s had started off really with actually a lot of problems, as we saw in the last PowerPoint on the 1970s, the Nixon years. We had a president who had resigned in disgrace. We had a war that had been ended, although not necessarily won, which left a lot of people confused. And as we'll see in this portion of our look at the 1970s, there was a lot more that was going on throughout the country that really disturbed a lot of Americans. And it was a lot of seemingly small and regional things, although some of them, of course, were much larger and had much larger implications as far as the rest of the country. One of the most overreaching phenomena that was happening during the 1970s, partly due to the American economy not being as prosperous as people thought it was that two things were on the rise, which usually should not happen at the same time, but for some reason they were in the 1970s. One was something called inflation, meaning gradually money was lessening in value. And at the same time, we had a steady rise in unemployment. And this was largely due to the fact that the American economy had slowed down after the post-World War II boom and really had not recovered after this big boom throughout the 1950s and most of the 1960s. One of the things that had heavily taxed the American economy during those years had been the war in Vietnam. And as people started to gradually lose jobs, and the pay that they were getting not as valuable, people really started to see the economy as being something that needed to be addressed by the government as it had been before. And people were really kind of scratching heads going, I really don't understand why this is starting to happen. And in addition, we also started to see prices of American commodities fall. So not only are people's value of their money going down, the prices of commodities are falling, which means people who are producing those commodities aren't making as much money. And to top it all off, we have a gradually rising unemployment rate. So this led and really kind of set up the entire decade for a decade where, after the last 2 decades, the American economy had grown. We almost went through an entire decade in the 1970s where the American economy really didn't grow as we might think it would. Now, another thing that added to the economic crisis that was slowly building throughout the 1970s was a oil shortage. The United States supported the country of Israel during a war that had broken out between that country and several other Arab countries that surround it. This was known as the Yom Kippur Wars, named for a holiday, a Jewish holiday that the war had started on. Well, in response to the support that the United States gave to Israel, the surrounding Arab countries, who were part of an organization and still are, called OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. These are those Middle Eastern countries that are responsible for so much, and still are responsible for so much of the world's oil. In response to America's support of Israel during this time, those Arab countries that were part of OPEC decided to shut off their supply of oil to the United States. Existing oil supplies skyrocketed in price to the point where gasoline had to be rationed. Now, as a very young child, I can tell you, I remember actually sitting in my parents' car as my mother parked in what were called gas lines. And basically, you lined up at your local gas station for however much gasoline you were allowed to take, regardless of how much your tank could actually hold. Now, mind you, this is also during a period of time where American products are not necessarily the latest and greatest anymore. Japanese cars coming out of Germany like Mercedes-Benz and BMW are sportier, faster, giving better gas mileage. And of course, American cars are these huge boats. These, like I think I mentioned before, they were called pitmobiles. And, they were just these, the typical look at a large car from the 70s, and they were gas guzzlers. They were horrible on the economy. So this is something that made the economy even worse. All three presidents during the 1970s, starting with Nixon, followed by the guy who replaced him when he resigned, guy you see there in the middle, his name was Gerald Ford. He was president until the end of what would have been Nixon's second term in 1976. In 1976, he ran for re-election. We're talking about Ford, and he lost to a former governor of Georgia, who you see down there at the bottom. That's Jimmy Carter. And the interesting thing about all three of these guys is that none of them seem to have an answer for the stagflation, as it became known, problem. This is where you had a stagnant or economy that isn't moving, isn't growing, and in combination with a growing inflation rate, which was really, really bad. Now, while the inflation rate was very high, so was the interest rate, where people who had money in the bank actually were making quite a bit because the banks were charging a very large interest rate in order to, maintain their money supply. So people who had money in the bank were actually doing great. To try and borrow money to buy a house or a car was really hard in the 1970s. And that was because of this very large inflation rate. Now we can look here and see what they did. Nixon tried fighting inflation first by cutting government spending, but ultimately he imposed price and wage controls. And that usually sends inflation going up higher because people are afraid that they're actually never going to get paid much ever again. Gerald Ford tried instituting what he called Whip Inflation Now, or WIN, and it asked Americans to voluntarily control spending and demanding larger paychecks and wage and price increases. That didn't work. Carter tried tax and spending cuts, but that didn't work either, and by the time he left office, inflation was at 18%, which means your money could buy 18% less than it could the previous year as the 1970s rolled on, with unemployment going from 6 to 8%. We're going to switch gears here into a social issue that was very important at the time, and perhaps still is. Amongst feminists at the time who were really pushing for more rights and more opportunities for women came the idea of what they called an Equal Rights Amendment. This would have been an amendment to the Constitution which those that wanted it claimed would guarantee an equal place for women in the workplace, as well as also politically. Now, as we've seen in just recent years, we've had a lot of female candidates, and a lot of women have won those positions, whether they be political or also, in the world of big business as well. There were also those that opposed the Equal Rights Amendment, or what they called the ERA. And one of the reasons why it was opposed was a lot of women felt at the time that if this were passed, it would threaten a lot of traditional values as far as women's place in the home and in American society. Now, I know that's very vague and it's not very specific as far as what they were really talking about, but what's important to understand is ultimately their side won. The ERA actually did pass Congress, but in order for an amendment to become part of the Constitution, it also has to be ratified by the various states. And almost 10 years later, after its conception, it failed to reach that number in order to become part of the Constitution. And so as a result, the Equal Rights Amendment actually ended up failing to become an actual amendment to the Constitution. Other people also suggested that it wasn't really necessary, that in fact it was the demand for equality was covered under the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, which include gender as something that cannot be used against a person to deny them either A, their civil rights or equal rights in the workplace, and or their right to vote. And so people said, well, it's not really needed. Some people believe it may be needed now. On a completely other issue, we here in Core Academy have a great love for the environment, and it was during the 1970s that one of the worst environmental disasters in American history took place. Actually, there were two. This is the first. This took place in a place near Niagara Falls, New York. This, of course, is the state of New York. And essentially what you had here was you had a housing development, large number of houses, whose backyards were near what they called the Love Canal. The Love Canal was this former, it was kind of like a creek, but it was also an area very near some chemical plants. And many of the people who owned these houses, either they or their spouses or other family members or friends, worked at these various chemical plants. And what was discovered was that a lot of these chemical plants for decades had been dumping their chemical waste byproducts from what they were creating in the chemical plants into this backyard area, which was right next to these people's homes. This material had gotten to the groundwater. It had poisoned the local water supply. And as a result, numbers of people who lived all along there developed all kinds of diseases in responses in response to this. Essentially, it's toxic waste, toxic poison. When it was discovered that the companies who owned these chemical plants knew what it could do to people, the neighbors actually invited representatives of those chemical plants into a home, and they actually somewhat they barricaded the home until the government would come in and try and solve the problem. In 1980, at the very end of his presidential term, Carter listed the entire area as a federal disaster area, and many of the family members were transported to new homes. However, for many, the nightmare kind of went on. Another environmental disaster, which was on a much larger scale, took place at a place called 3 Mile Island in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. This was a nuclear plant throughout the 60s and 70s. Nuclear energy was seen as a very cost-efficient source of electrical power. And unfortunately, this was one of the first times that people could see what happened when a reactor malfunctioned. And essentially what happened was you have a steam compressor that also works to contain the various chemical processes that happen within a nuclear reactor. And if you have a leak, a number of things can happen. You have an escape of steam, which can hurt people. You can have a radiation leak. If the reactor, which is powering the power plant, isn't properly cooled, which is usually the fear, that reactor can actually melt down and you can have a nuclear explosion. Now, that didn't happen here, but what did happen was you had a malfunction occur in the cooling system of the reactor, and you did have some radiation leak from the reactor. And radiation, of course, can be deadly, can cause cancer. And so as a result, 3 Mile Island was unfortunately a glowing example of while nuclear energy could be very cheap and very beneficial, the dangers of it going bad or something happening were almost far more dangerous than it was worth. It was more dangerous than the lure of cheap electrical power being generated by nuclear reactors. So, I mean, this was just, yet another example of, an environmental disaster. First we had Love Canal, then we had 3 Mile Island. It seemed the environment itself in the United States was almost, rebelling, as if to say, you know what, we've kind of had enough here. And this kind of just led to the feeling of really not knowing which way was up in the 1970s. Now we talk about a social phenomenon that happened in the 1970s. Here we had probably one of the biggest ones of them all, and that was the disco era. And nothing was more iconic in the 1970s more than the movie Saturday Night Fever, which starred John Travolta as Tony Manero, dancing in those polyester outfits with that, hair dryer blown hair and the moves and the whole bit. But the disco movement itself and the whole, what became known as the Me Decade, really was indicative of how people thought of themselves during the 1970s. They said, well, the government's corrupt, the economy isn't great, everything is just kind of beige, everything is just kind of blah. Let's just disappear into a disco room and party it up, because who cares about what's going on outside? Let's just, sink everything into just party. And so you had disco clubs, springing up all over the country. Initially, it was actually something that was primarily associated with the gay community. However, it quickly translated into something that was very mainstream. Studio 54, which was this enormous nightclub in New York City, was famous for celebrities that were seen at it. It was also famous for, a huge drug culture that was free flowing through the club. People used to say you could sniff cocaine off the carpet in certain parts of the club. It was a perfect example of everything that just wasn't happening in society at that time. I mean, people were dancing to this, very mechanized music that's got the same beat over and over and over again. People had this, everybody was dressing the same, they were dancing the same music, and they were just partying like they used to say, they were partying like it's 1999. And it was a phenomenon in society that people became just so self-involved because it didn't seem like a whole lot else in the country was really all that much to care about. And so people really turned inwards. They turned to themselves and just making sure that it was all about me. A more serious issue that was kind of the last gasps of the civil rights movement was something called busing. One of the things that was really pushed in many states, in many cities, was the idea of mixing what used to be formerly segregated racial groups. So instead of just having, the white kids come to the black school and the black kids go to the white school, why don't we mix them together? And a lot of states instituted what was called forced busing. And essentially what that meant was you took some kids that would go to a school that they used to go to right by them, which was probably dominated by one particular ethnic group, and then you would bus them across town, often quite a ways away, to another school where you had a school dominated by another ethnic group. And this was what they called forced integration. And the response to this was violent. People who may not even care about the various, ethnic or racial issues that had been so dominant in the 1960s now found themselves really being shoved into it. I can tell you that I myself was subjected to busing, or at least could have been. And essentially, I was sent home with a letter, and my parents were told that if my name was pulled, it was a lottery system, that I would be shipped to a elementary school in South Central Los Angeles called Virginia Road Elementary School. And I remember starting in my second and third grade, all of a sudden there were a lot of kids I didn't recognize anymore. A lot of Latino and black kids who started showing up. And they were from that area. They were from, further downtown Los Angeles versus further on the west side of Los Angeles where I had been raised. So in a lot of areas of the country, including Boston, the opposition to busing became very violent. And instead, in some cases, some white parents simply took their kids out of the public systems and sent them to private schools, or they simply moved away to areas that didn't have busing. This was known as white flight. And so you had that response to it as well. This country's relationship with countries in the Middle East had always been very difficult. And it was primarily because initially we supported a country that many of the other countries in the Middle East did not see as a legitimate one, and that was the country of Israel. And ever since the early 1970s, Israel and the neighboring country of Egypt had been at war. Jimmy Carter really wanted to put his stamp on the history of the American presidency with his finally settling this war. And ultimately, he was able to get a peace treaty signed between Egypt and Israel, between the Egyptian leader Anwar Sadat and the Israeli leader Menachem Begin. Unfortunately, a peace treaty is not what the people of their countries wanted. And within the next couple of years, both of those Middle Eastern leaders were assassinated. But in the meantime, Carter was able to ring up a success, I guess you could say, by putting together what he called the Camp David Accords. These were the peace arrangements ending the war between Israel and Egypt. On the other hand, Carter really made a mistake when it came to his relations with another Middle Eastern country, and that was the country of Iran. Since the 1950s, Iran had been run by the Shah, this inherited leader who was supported primarily because he was an anti-communist. And in the late 70s, Carter hailed the Shah as a great humanitarian, when in reality he was a pretty brutal dictator. And meanwhile, a lot of young people were rallying around an Islamic cleric with a very anti-Western stance called the Ayatollah Khomeini. His first name was the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. He was a religious leader that really wanted to turn Iran into a theocracy, a government firmly based upon the Islamic tradition. And with American support of the Shah, opposition and protests against the United States started to really intensify. And it got to the point where the Shah was deciding whether or not he even wanted to remain in Iran. And in combination with that and the fact that apparently he also had cancer and wanted to have the operation in the United States, he was actually allowed asylum in the United States. In other words, he wanted to stay there because he was afraid he was going to get killed. So he runs to the United States. He's allowed to come to the United States, and the fact that the United States welcomes him with open arms absolutely infuriates the people of Iran. And in November of 1979, they stormed the American embassy. This is obviously where American diplomats and representatives of the American government who are dealing with Iran were stationed. Iranian students actually raided the embassy and took 66 Americans hostage. This became known as the Iran hostage crisis, because what they demanded was the freeing of various Islamic terrorists that had, killed people, blown people up, other things like this. And so their deal was to hold on to them. There was even an attempt at one point on the part of the Carter administration to go get these hostages, and it failed. These military helicopters actually ended up crashing somewhere in the desert. That was blasted all over the news. And finally, what it really came down to was the Iranian people thumbing their middle fingers, quite honestly, up at President Carter, because in 1980, Carter runs for re-election and he is wiped out by the Republican challenger, Ronald Reagan. And literally, it is as Ronald Reagan is taking the oath of presidency that the hostages are finally released, which was kind of seen as a final, kind of FU to Jimmy Carter because of what he had done with the Shah. And this is how the 1970s ends, guys. You've got all of this turmoil going on throughout the country, and the 1970s ends without a bang or a whimper. At this point, what I'd like you guys to do is finish up your summary paragraph, and quite honestly, today's PowerPoint covered all three categories: political change, economic change, social change. I hope by now that you guys have seen these summary paragraphs as not merely just a part of the assignment, but a way of looking back at what we looked at in the set of PowerPoints as a way of kind of checking what has happened in this time period and taking a look at just how far America had come, what they had either come through, how they had advanced, how they moved forward, how had they moved backwards. What were some things that Americans simply had to just survive, like the 1970s?